Hi, everybody, and welcome. I'm Alison Flood from The Guardian. I'm here with Michael Farris Smith, who is a leading voice in Southern fiction. His novels range from Blackwood, a slice of Southern Gothic set around the dark events and the dark past of a small Mississippi town, to Rivers, in which extreme weather ravages the Gulf Coast and a man tries to flee. He's been awarded prizes including the Mississippi Author Award for Fiction, the Transatlantic Review Award, and he's been a finalist for the Southern Book Prize and the Gold Dagger Award in the UK. His new novel, Nick, tells the story of Nick Carraway before The Great Gatsby. It's fantastically good, and he's going to read a little bit for us now before we chat about how the book came to be. Michael, take it away.
Thank you, Alison, and hello, everyone. I will just read a very short piece here, just a couple of minutes before we get rolling. Thank you for joining us. Nick walked along the sidewalk, and the fog swallowed him as he trudged with his pack across his back and his insides splitting, and he listened for her voice to call him. He listened for her to be the one to reach out and to somehow know all it was he wanted to say. He walked slowly and listened and waited for her voice to cut through the gray, but it did not come, and then he was too far away from her to turn back. As he approached the train station, he saw the other uniforms summoned to return, and he heard the engines and the whistles, and he was certain that he was going to die in this war. And when he did die, who would be at his funeral to truly mourn? There would be a coffin in front of the sanctuary of the church, and his family and friends of his family and dedicated customers of his father's store and friends from the neighborhood and friends from school and an entire church filled with those who had some weightless attachment to him. And they would be there to share in the sadness, but who would be there to truly mourn, to gasp and pray and hurt and hope for his soul? Did anyone truly love him? And did he love anyone? And the answers to all of his questions were clear, and that was when he stopped and turned around and headed back for the cafe, walking first and then running, the pack heavy on his back and his mouth open in panic and the fog thick and like a curtain that hid her from him. He ran and he saw the lights of the cafe through the gray, and he called for her and believed that he would have someone to mourn and someone to mourn him when the day finally came to lie down and leave the world to the others. He called out to her as he ran, and when he reached the cafe, he stepped inside and wiped his eyes and looked to their table. But she was gone. The small man was wiping the bar and humming. He stopped and looked at Nick, and then he pointed toward the door she had walked through. He clapped his hands and said, "Veet, Veet." And when Nick stood still, he slapped the bar and shouted as if to wake him. Nick dropped his pack and shoved it in the corner of the cafe and ran out. So little time between now and the train's departure, and he ran along the sidewalk toward Boulevard de Clichy, where they had walked so often in the last days. Several blocks, and at each turn he expected to see her ahead, to catch her and say those things to her, but she was never there. He wondered if he had run past her in the fog or missed her at another cafe, and the fog seemed to thicken with his anxiety, and he turned and called and searched, but she was not there. He listened for her voice and he ran again, and he began to grab at strangers, though he knew they were strangers, but he grabbed them with the fraught hope that her face would be on the unfamiliar figure. They screamed and slapped when the frantic man in an American uniform pulled at them and said, "Where is she? Where is she?" And then he gave up. He snatched a cafe chair and stood on it as if it might lift and carry him to her, but there was only the fog in every direction and nothing magical about the chair. He could not miss the train. He would not. It was not what he had been trained to do. He called again and again and again. A waiter stood next to him and fussed, and then Nick stepped down from the chair. He retraced his steps to the cafe with his eyes searching no more, but only straight ahead at the ground before him. And when he reached the cafe, the small man said something to him in French that he both understood and did not understand. He lifted the pack from the floor and stuck his arms through the loops, and he marched toward Gare Saint-Lazare as if he were already there in the mud and the blood. He arrived at the station as the porter made the final call, and he climbed into a car, but he did not sit down. He stood in the aisle and looked across the heads of the passengers, out onto the platform, pretending to see her. Thank you. That's from the first chapter
Yeah, I was going to say, wow, that was great. Sent shivers down my spine. Can you tell us a little bit about this is Nick, who's sort of leaving the a woman that he has met in Paris, right, and going back to the front. Can you tell us a little bit more about kind of how the book opens and where this fits in?
Yeah, well, when I had the idea for Nick, the more I thought about it, and some other things I kind of read about, Hemingway and A Movable Feast, and how he mentioned that none of those, they didn't trust anyone who hadn't been in the war during that generation. It really occurred to me that starting Nick in the war would be a logical place to begin, because it's one of the first connections him and Gatsby make in their first dialogue with each other. They make the connection of the war, and I always felt like that was a very important thing between those two men, and between any people who have served in like traumatic situations that survived. You have some type of unspoken bond, emotionally, mentally, psychologically, that I don't think other people could understand. So when I thought about Nick and the way he seemed to be so detached and lonely and kind of desolate and almost on the edge of breaking down to me all the time when I was reading Gatsby, I thought, well, certainly the war had an impact on that. So that's where I began Nick, with him in the cafe with this woman he has met. But he can almost hear the train whistle blowing. He can almost hear the explosions on the front and everything that's waiting for him back, and how torn he would be in that moment, not just fearful for his own life, but also on the edge of something that seems like it has possibility for him in an emotional way that he hasn't quite experienced yet.
I hadn't thought this before, but as you were reading that, it reminded me of the end of The Great Gatsby, when nobody comes to Gatsby's funeral apart from Nick and one other person, is it? And there's Nick kind of thinking that lots of people will be at his, but that none of them will really be there for him. There's a kind of echo there between the two.
Yeah, it's very smart of you to recognize that. One of the things I had to do in writing this novel, or one of the things I really wanted to do, is take some of those things that lingered in Gatsby, whether they were more overt or whether they were more subtle. And for me, this was one of those more subtle kind of brushstrokes that kind of were the beginning of Nick, and the things he's thinking end up mirroring, the tail end of Gatsby, when he's having some of these same questions and curiosities about life. And you get the notion he's always had those same curiosities and questions. And doubt, I think, is a big deal too. Doubt seems to be a big issue. And I think that's one of those moments when I did kind of resonate those emotions between.
Yeah, I think we need to go back, though. We need to go back as to why you decided to sit down and write a story that gave us Nick's kind of backstory. What gave you the idea that writing a prequel to The Great Gatsby was where you wanted to go next with your novels?
I mean, it's strange to even think that that's what you would end up doing one day. If you would have told me 5 minutes before I sat down to read Gatsby 5 years ago that that's what I was going to end up doing, I probably would not have believed you, because I had read Gatsby a few times. Once when I was at university, when I was about 19 or 20, didn't get it, didn't care about it at all, completely just set it aside and forgot about it. And then I read it again about 7 or 8 years later, after I'd left home and been living abroad for a few years. And I really began at that stage too. I was reading a lot of the Lost Generation writers, and I was also reading just about the time period and the feelings and kind of the artistic things that were going on too. And they were having a big impact to me because I was kind of a wanderer too, and I was kind of unsure of home and country, and my notion and of things, of things that I've been taught and things that I've been led to believe was shifting and changing too. And when I read it then, I felt those things in it. But still, you fast forward, it was another 15 years before I picked it up again. And this was in 2014. And I just picked it up and read it because it was short and I didn't remember anything about it. And I thought, here's something I can knock out in an afternoon. And as I began to read it, it's like something just on every page seemed to just really speak to me and resonate with me. It was either, it was at this point my second novel had been published, so I kind of had some success as a writer. I had crossed that long bridge to get there, and the language of it was really striking to me, and the things that Fitzgerald was doing stylistically. But the emotions of it were just seemed to be. I just felt such a loneliness in it, and I felt the fragility of it all. And I think I've experienced those emotions myself in my life. I think we all have.
Especially right now.
Especially right now. I mean, I think we can all look at ourselves, look at this time last year, this time 14 months ago, and think about how all of our lives have changed and become more fragmented and disjointed and kind of isolated, and by no fault of our own. And I sense that in Nick too. As I was reading at that time, it just really struck me. When he doesn't realize it's his birthday, I was like, how detached do you have to be from yourself? What must have happened to you? What is going on inside for you not even to realize it's your birthday, and seemingly a big birthday because he's turning 30, and he makes a big deal out of it being a decade of loneliness that he's right on the edge of. And that was the phrase that really hit me, because it was when I was 29 when I came back to Mississippi after being gone from 10 years, came back to my small hometown, and I had decided I was going to try to write, and I didn't even really know what that meant. And I returned to a place where my family didn't live there anymore. My friends had gotten married, had children, gotten jobs, bought houses. I mean, the place was just not the same. I wasn't the same. The place I was kind of an alien. And I remember thinking, well, I'm about to turn 30 and have a duffel bag on my shoulder. And that's pretty much it. And I'm going to try to write whatever the hell that means. And it was both. It was really frightening and really exhilarating all at the same time. And those emotions that Nick is going through there at the end of Gatsby just really kind of gut punched me. Like they hit me in a way I wasn't expecting, to the point where I couldn't stop thinking about it, like for days after. It resonated with me so strongly. And because it's in first person, Nick tells us very little about himself. And I just kept wondering what brought him to see things the way he does and to feel things the way he does. And just the very basic thought, as if, I was having a conversation with you or anyone about the book, I just kind of in my head out loud said, it'd be really interesting if someone was to write Nick's story. And just in that moment, I just knew I was going to do it. I mean, I was so like drawn to it emotionally already, which is really the only reason I ever write any novel, is because I've got something in my head that I just can't shake. And I knew it was going to be a stretch, man. I mean, I knew it was going to be different, but I also knew that I was going to do it. And that's how I came to see. I mean, I sat down immediately and began working on it. And I didn't tell anybody I was doing it. I didn't tell my agent. I didn't tell my editor. I didn't even realize there was copyright thing. I never looked it up. I didn't care. I just sat down and wrote the novel. And then when I was done, I kind of handed it over and said, well, this is what I've been doing 10 months later. And
did you feel, when you sat down to start doing it, did you feel like the weight of literary history on your shoulders, or did you manage to ignore that?
No, I felt all that. I mean, in the moment that I had the idea to do it and I thought, well, I'm going to do this. And the next moment I thought, yeah, there's a lot going on here you're going to have to deal with. I mean, I did feel the literary weight of it, or the heft, or whatever. And in the beginning of writing that, I think that felt heavier. But as the novel began to move along and Nick began to create in my mind, and he began to have his own life, and the novel began to take its own form, that kind of fell away. And I just began to feel more like I do when I write a novel, trying to be true to the character and true to create as a dynamic a setting and scenario as I could, while at the same time, I did have these things to deal with making Nick believable to be Nick, or feeding in those small things we know about him and those kind of emotions that we know about him. I did feel it, and I think I probably, even thinking about it now, maybe I feel it even now. Some days more than others.
So did you sit down with The Great Gatsby and go through and pull out any little scrap of detail that Fitzgerald gives us about Nick's past? Like, how did you start?
I did reread Gatsby a couple of times through the writing of Nick, and I would just maybe dog-ear pages or maybe underline specific things that really hit me, particular thoughts he would have, or particular emotions, or particular comments. Because Nick was really good in Gatsby. He's such an unreliable narrator. He's good at making these kind of generic statements about his life and about his emotions without giving you too much detail. And so those were almost fodder for me. Those would seem like opportunities for me to fill in those blanks with an actual event or with an actual experience that would then resonate later when you read Gatsby later and you go across those lines now. Like even I look back at those lines that I kind of picked out or those passages and I read them now and I'm like, of course he feels that way. You know, of course he does.
I've explained it now.
Yeah. And I would say even after I did the final revision, or as we were doing the final revisions last year, I really didn't want to read it again. But I did. I sat down and I went through it again because I just wanted to make sure, and it felt very organic to me then. And I kind of relaxed and let it go at that point.
You go into great and disturbing detail in the first half of the novel about what it would have been like to be in the trenches in the First World War. What was your research like for that?
Well, I think most of us we learn about World War I in history books and trench warfare and things like that, or we see it depicted in movies and film. So we have some kind of idea about it. But when when I sat down to read in more detail about what it was actually like and what these people went through those experiences and shell shock and things like that, it was just so grisly and horrible. And what a nightmare to have been involved in that. And I didn't want to sugarcoat it, I mean, I wanted to make World War One like World War One was. I wanted to make it the experience for Nick and those others who were in the middle of it very real, because I think what happens sometimes is it gets romanticized a little bit. I think even in Gatsby, it's romanticized just a little bit. I think Nick says to Gatsby how much he enjoyed the war, and I feel like that's certainly a defense mechanism, and that he's lying, and that he's putting up his mask on. But that felt just a little bit romanticized for me, and I thought in creating someone who I felt was as lonely and kind of disillusioned as Nick was, I wanted to make his experience in the war very real, so that the reader could too then kind of go along with this detachment and this notion of, okay, when you come back home, how in the hell are you supposed to just walk back home, return to the Midwest to a white picket fence where people, want you to get up and go to work at 8 o'clock in the morning and come home at 5 o'clock in the afternoon? It just doesn't seem reasonable.
I think that's so true what you say about it potentially being romanticized, because you really don't make anything seem heroic. These are just ordinary people in this horrific situation, and you really pinpoint little details which brought it home to me, how just the sheer horror of it all, like Nick counting the stones in his pocket to count how many days he'd been there for, or just taking out his memories and looking over them again because he's literally got nothing else to do while he sits there waiting in the mud.
Yeah, really. I mean, it was, one of the questions I had about it and looking about it and reading about it was, how in the hell did anybody survive it? Truly, and so I kind of implemented that into it some. It's like, it's not necessarily, I think any heroic acts that happen just in the act of chaos. I think it was largely just about surviving from one day to the next and doing whatever it was you had to do, either from a psychological standpoint or from a physical standpoint of the actual act itself of having to go and kill someone before they killed you.
And Gatsby talks about how he gets a medal for his valor in the forest, doesn't he? And you show a different side to the forest when Nick is there. I mean, I think that is the most disturbing part of the book, maybe for me, was that bit to read, what it would have been like digging through the mud, listening and waiting for death. It's very dark place compared to Gatsby's medals.
Yeah, I actually I saw a very short documentary, I think, on YouTube about the forest warfare and what that was like, and then the tunnels. I also wanted Nick to have I wanted him to be in the war, but I wanted him to have a little different job too. And that's where the tunnels came in. When I started reading about the tunnels and the war beneath the war, it was completely fascinating to me, and how high the death rates were. And they died of carbon monoxide, and they died of the tunnels closing in on them. And it was almost like a death sentence to be sent into the tunnels or to volunteer for the tunnels. And like we said, you get those snippets in Gatsby. um, about, well, I did this or did that. Okay, well, I wanted to show what that really meant. Like, if you that's what you did, then let's depict what that was really like. You know, if
Mhm.
we're gonna create the experience, then I really wanted to create the experience as um, enthusiastically and as propulsively as I thought I could.
Your Nick, like Fitzgerald's Nick, he's a listener, isn't he? He's like an observer. He's detached, even in the middle of all of this. Even the role that you give him is a listener in the middle of chaos.
Yeah, exactly. Which, in a sense, is what he does in Gatsby. You know,
Yeah,
he's a wallflower in the middle of chaos. And
yeah,
I thought, you know, too, some of his boyhood, childhood stuff with with his mother and his father, and his mother kind of suffering with some things to where she kind of disappears, and Nick kind of waits in the hallway. I'm not spoiling anything by talking about this, but waits in the hallway as a boy to see if she's okay, just kind of standing there waiting and listening. You know, I felt like that was something that had been developed from, you know, early on, something he probably always had carried with him.
yeah, absolutely. And and Fitzgerald as well shows us the glimpses of the loneliness at Nick's core. I think sometimes he just, for me, one of the moments there is when he's at the party with Myrtle and Tom, and all of this scene is going on all around him, and he's kind of sitting there and like coming in and out of being there, not really part of everything, and just watching. And I think that really the darkness for Yornik and the loneliness of Yornik really tallies with that in Gatsby.
Yeah, thank you. You know, that was certainly one of the things that I wanted to portray in Nick. But the other thing that I wanted to portray, which I hope I did in Nick, is that while he has been a wallflower and a listener, he's also had opportunities in his life to make decisions where he didn't make the right decision, or where he went wrong, or where he had an opportunity. Like with Ella, he has an opportunity there, but
So
he's not
Ella is the woman in Paris,
the
right?
woman in Paris. And then once he meets Judah and Colette too, he has these opportunities for connections or for relationships. And like, I mean, I think there's several instances in Nick where he has these opportunities to um, you know, make emotional connections, or even change his life. You know, I think we all have had those moments where we had this fork in the road, where if you make one decision, your life is going to go this way. If you make the other, it's going to go the other way. And we can all look back on those. And you know, Nick's own life is filled with those too, which I think is an attribute when he gets to Gatsby. We see him able to really easily participate in what's going on there. When Jay tells him about Daisy and this kind of idealistic dream he has about recreating the past, Nick is very easily goes into that and falls into that and kind of just nods and helps. And it occurred to me during the course of all that too, that he's likely had instances in his life where he was on the edge of these things and wishes he could do them over too. And maybe he would have done something different. And maybe that's why he goes so easily along with Jay, kind of dream scenario for him and Daisy. He's been there. He can relate to the feelings
Yeah.
that are involved.
Yeah, goes along with it is a good description for kind of the person that he is there, isn't it? He sort of goes along, he's sort of there, taking part, but not exactly at the heart of things, I guess. So can you talk a bit about the second half of the novel? Was it obvious to you when you began that you'd have Nick coming back from the war, and you were going to write about him in the US as well on his return? Or did you always know that would be how you kind of continued?
Yeah, I knew that he would come back to the US. I really didn't want him to go like home to the Midwest. I had no idea where he was going to go. I mean, in the second part of the book, when he's on the train coming back from France and he's coming, you know, across towards Chicago to where he makes this connection to go home, and he's riding on the train and looking out at the landscape, and wondering kind of what he's going to do. I was also, that was me also wondering what he was going to do. And I think he has that spur of the moment decision where he gets on a train to New Orleans instead of going back home because of, you know, this thought Ella has put in his head back in Paris. That was, you know, when he decided to go to New Orleans, that was kind of when I decided it too. And it made perfect sense to me because he's got to go somewhere. Why not bring him to a part of the world that I really know about? Bring him into my backyard. And again, when I started reading about New Orleans and what it was like in 1919, I was just fascinated by it.
It's such an interesting period with prohibition on the horizon, and it feels like a tinderbox the way that you write it.
Absolutely. I mean, prohibition's on the horizon, and New Orleans is already known for its, laissez-faire attitude about just about, whatever. And, that prostitution is legal, and it's a very crazy multicultural place at this time too. So many different dialects being spoken. Italian, there's Italian population, a Spanish population. There's racial diversity. I mean, and two, when I thought about that, I'm like, this is a part of America Nick has no idea that exists, right? He's from the very conservative, upper middle class Midwest, and now let's drop him into his own country in a place that's going to be very different for him and eye-opening in a way. I think in the same way that West Egg and that whole scene is also different for him. When he gets there on Gatsby's doorstep, that's not something he's familiar with, those people and that lifestyle. So he goes to New Orleans, and he already is discovering and figuring out this country is a big place, and the way I've been brought up and the way I've learned things has been changed. One, because of the war, which was not my choice, but two, in New Orleans, I can make my own choices about things because I am kind of, technically at home in a home country, not in a hometown, but still. And I'm a sucker for landscape, and I'm a sucker for setting, and New Orleans offered that in any number of ways, and
I can see someone in the chat has written that they would love to have visited in that era. I mean, I'm not sure, having read your depiction of it, how much I would have loved it. It's definitely interesting to read. And there as well, you show Nick coming into contact with another veteran in Judas, and what you said before, that people can recognize other people who have been through this experience is really true with them, because Judas has come off a lot worse, right?
Yeah, Judas actually probably had it worse than Nick. He's terribly scarred by the mustard gas, and it's gotten into his insides, and he's deteriorating inside and out. I mean, he's not long for this world, but him and Nick make the connection. They just kind of lay eyes on one another, and there's a lot that's unspoken between them, which I mean, it feels like a very real thing, I mean, I think we know enough about PTSD and shell shock and all those things now. I mean, I even know I've had friends of mine who have been, done tours, and they come back and they're not they're a little bit different, and they got a little bit different look in their eye. And I would even say, not to diminish what they've done or what they do, but in comparison to, World War I and trench warfare, it's very different. And I think just that unspoken thing between people who have shared that experience was a dynamic that has always been interesting to me. And I think that him and Judah get to explore that together, while Nick is also just trying to make sense of where the hell he is and what the hell he's doing next. Before he gets to New York, there's that space and time where I thought putting him together with someone like Judah was only going to ratchet things up, to another level.
Yeah. When you set out to write, did you ever consider aping Fitzgerald's style? No. The when I had the idea to do it, I told you that in the minutes after, I thought about kind of the literary weight of it all. The next thing I thought was, okay, this might work out because Nick is in first person, which means there's little info about him. I can put it in third person, and I can stand back and I can look at Nick, and I can present his world and the world of the people around him, and I don't have to worry about sounding like F. Scott Fitzgerald, because anybody who sits down to write 250 or 300 pages trying to mimic F. Scott Fitzgerald is in for a losing proposition already, And plus, I mean, it's a story I wanted to tell, but I wanted to tell it as Michael Farris Smith. I mean, I didn't want to tell it as F. Scott. Writing as F. Scott Fitzgerald.
Well, the only thing I did consider is in dialogue, when Nick in parts of dialogue, I did consider how he sounds when he's telling us the story of Gatsby, and I did consider how he talks and how he sounds in Gatsby, so that when I was creating his dialogue in Nick too, I was trying to at least fall in the ballpark, I think, of how Nick Carraway actually sounds when he.
Oh, tell me a bit more about that. How do you mean? I don't think I can remember well enough what he sounds like in Gatsby to.
Well, I don't know that I can explain it either. It's just one of those things where when I wrote his dialogue, I would every now and then look back into Gatsby just to see, like, is this the same person, like, talking? Not just in terms of like words that he might use or phrases that he might use. Like, I didn't want to like give him a vocabulary that he didn't own. So I had to pay attention. There were many balls to juggle in the course of writing this novel, and that was one of them. And I wanted to be true to when he spoke, and he doesn't say a lot either. He tells us a lot in Gatsby, but in the dialogue sequences, he never says very much. And I think that was something I considered too. I wasn't going to give Nick two paragraphs of dialogue when the most he ever says is about two sentences back to back. So it was not only just what he said, but how he said those things also that it was I needed to pay attention to.
Yeah. When you sat down to write, did you write it all consecutively, or did you know the point that you were writing to? I don't want to give away what happens at the end, but I mean, I think we all know that Nick survives this book because he's going to appear in The Great Gatsby. But were you always writing to that? I mean, the end of your book is wonderful. It just gave me shivers to get to that point and see where we were in the story, and made me want to go read both of them all over again. But did you write it in a line, or did you write the end and then kind of go back and see where you were?
This was very interesting on a dozen levels, but the way it was different from the way I usually work is I knew where this was going to end. I knew what those last few pages were going to be before I got there, which is not how I typically, when I write a novel, I never do that. Like, it's just follow the trail, follow the trail, follow the trail, and eventually things come together, piece together, and all of a sudden you're at the end. Whereas here, I knew where I wanted to leave him. Like, I knew the scene where I wanted to leave him, but how to get him there, I did kind of relinquish and just let that unfold again, because I wanted to be surprised by it. And I think that's why I write the way I do. Sometimes it's linear. Sometimes I would just have an idea for a scene that I know belongs somewhere, but I'm not sure exactly where it belongs. And I'll just write that scene, and then I'll figure out where it goes. I don't know if it goes like right on the end of what I did yesterday, or if it might go 50 pages earlier, if it would fit better there. So there's kind of some back and forth, but I did know where I would leave him. Getting him there was much more of the kind of following the broken trail that I usually follow when I'm typically writing a novel. Yeah. It's funny you said my mom was reading it, and she sent me a text, and she said, I'm reading about New Orleans, and if I didn't know he made it already, I'd probably be scared he's not going to make it. And I said, yeah, spoiler alert, Mom, it's okay. He's going to live.
He's going to be okay. So you got him there to the point where we leave him, and you told your agent and your editor, oh, hey, by the way, I've just written a prequel to The Great Gatsby. Now, what was their reaction?
It was kind of it was a long pause, silence after I said that. And then the next question was, when can I see it? And I sent it. I gave it to him without any type of setup, synopsis, anything. I just said, look, I've written Nick Carraway's story, and I've written him up to the moment a couple of years before he meets Gatsby. And that's what I've been doing. And they were like, when can I see it? And about 48 hours later, the phone rang, and they were like, I think we got something here. I don't think any agent or editor could ever expect you to call them and tell them that's what you've been doing. Particularly, too, like, when the announcement was made about this novel in July, that was solely because we've been sitting here waiting on it for 5 years. I wrote the novel, and I wrote it without consideration of any of this other stuff with Gatsby, copyright or anything, just because it was the novel I wanted to write, and it was the novel I wanted to read, and I felt very strongly tied to it. So I think when I dropped it in their lap, then they had to consider all those things.
Yeah, and you guys managed to stay quiet about it all of that time.
We did. Once we found out it would be January 1st, 2021 before it would come out, we really put it on lockdown, and everybody kind of did one of these things right here, zipped their lip and threw away the key. And I kept writing during that time, which it turns out to be that was a very important step for me. I think I kept writing and published 3 novels in between them because I kept evolving and maturing as a writer. And what happened was, my battery's about to die. Let me plug my computer in real quick.
I'm just going to have a look at all the questions you guys are sending in, because there's some great ones here.
I should have done this before. Sorry. Okay. So what happened was, I kept writing and publishing, and when I went to revise Nick last year, and I started to read it again, I hadn't read it in a couple of years. I was editing myself from 5 years ago, which was a really interesting experience. And what I realized was I'd gotten better as a writer. Like, I was very happy. It wasn't that I was unhappy with the manuscript in any way, but I could see how I had evolved and my voice had matured as a writer. And like, while I was kind of devastated when I found out before we got to wait 5 years, I feel like now it worked out nicely because Nick's a better novel now than it would have been.
Mm-hmm.
Simply because I'm a better writer, and it really spoke to the kind of notion that you can get better at what you're doing, no matter if you think you can or not. You can.
10,000 hours.
Yeah, that's right. So I think things just kind of worked out.
Yeah. And how have you been feeling about the actual publication of the book? Have you been nervous about how people will take it, if they'll kind of react badly to you touching the sacred Gatsby?
Well, I kind of expected all that. I mean, like, I'm not naive. Like, I kind of knew in doing this that it's going to be kind of a bipolar book. I think for people, there would be people who would think I'd committed some type of literary sacrilege and take it really personally, and then there would be people who were very interested and couldn't wait and inspired to read it. And it's been all over the place. So I think I wrote the novel that I wanted to read, and that's all I can do. And I'm proud of it. And I know it's it's a strange, different animal, and I know it's going to be taken differently by different people, and that's fine. But it's hard to you can't second guess your art. You've got to do it, and you got to do it with as much gusto and love as you can do it, and then whatever happens, happens. What
do you think Fitzgerald would have thought about it?
I think he would love it. Honestly, I treated it as I was writing it, and I feel like this now, and I always would feel like it. I feel like it's an homage to Fitzgerald, and it's homage to Gatsby, and it's homage to the lost generation, a group of writers in an era that had a profound impact on me, both as a person and as a writer. I don't know how I could pay any more of a tribute to to the lost generation and that work, and to those feelings than I have done. It's just I think I would hope he would maybe one day he and I will sit down somewhere and have a drink and talk about it. That'd be really interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, excellent. Is there anyone else from Gatsby that you're going to give a backstory to?
No.
Or are you done with The Great Gatsby?
The only prequel I'll be writing ever, if it ever happens again, would be one of my own characters that walked out one of my own novels at some point. But yeah, I think I've done what I can do.
Who would you like to see drawn out or written about from The Great Gatsby? Is there anyone else who you would be interested in hearing more from?
No.
You're just done.
I'm done.
I can see someone has asked a great question in the chat. They've said, have you thought of doing the same for Faulkner?
What was that again? I'm sorry.
Sorry, someone in the chat has asked if you've thought of doing a similar thing for any of William Faulkner's novels.
Oh, no. No, I admire Faulkner. I love Faulkner, and I think he covered his own world pretty thoroughly. I really, I feel like this was a once in a lifetime thing, and I had very personal reasons for wanting to do it, and it challenged me in ways that I never expected, and it scared the hell out of me. And there were two things I could have done, and I thought about this in the very beginnings of it. It was embrace it with everything you got, or be scared of it and shrink back into a corner and don't do it and always wonder what would have happened. So this has been an experience that has been very unique to me, and I don't intend on replicating it.
Sure.
I have novels left to write, but this was a special experience that I think will remain unique for me.
Yeah, there's another great question in the chat from Kathy, who's asked, did you feel constrained at any point because Nick has to be the Nick that we meet in The Great Gatsby?
I don't know if constrained is the right word. I felt an allegiance to it. I think I felt respectful toward it, because I mean, that was part of me wanting to do it. Like, my whole kind of drive for it was, what makes Nick tell us the story the way he tells us the story? What makes him react to things the way he reacts to things? What makes him detach from himself the way he detaches from himself? So, yeah, not constrained necessarily, but respectful toward it in a way that you're not when you write anything else. My character is free to roam and do and decide and say things that with complete and utter free will. And I wouldn't say I robbed Nick of his free will in any way, but I did have to adhere to what I was trying to do: create the narrator of The Great Gatsby, create the guy who tells us the story.
Would you recommend for people who haven't read either novels reading your novel before Gatsby?
Yeah, I think that's the way to do it, and that's what I've been telling people. I think you read Nick first, and then read Gatsby after. One of the other things too is, like, I don't think you don't have to be familiar with Gatsby to read Nick. I mean,
one of the
other balls to juggle was I wanted to create also what I felt like would be a standalone novel. Like, you could read Nick and have a fully immersed emotional experience with it without even knowing who Jay Gatsby is. But I think telling people read Nick and then read Gatsby, and then talking to people who have done it that way, that seems to be like a really interesting way to go about it. Not that it depends on who it is, I guess, but I would say do it that way.
Excellent. So a question from Juan in Spain, which asks, do you deal at all with his possible homosexuality? And that's something I was going to ask as well, actually. Were you tempted by Fitzgerald's ... if you want to explore it, when he's he leaves those ellipses, doesn't he, after the party with Myrtle and Tom, when Nick kind of comes to standing beside Mr. McKee's bed with him in the bed in his underwear? I mean, did you want to look into that at all, or did you decide to leave that?
Well, I think maybe, like, I did think about that, but I think exploring it, I would say I explored it, but maybe not so directly. I think what I've done is I've left Nick at a place in his life where he's gone through this series of experiences, and I think I leave Nick as someone who is unsure of himself, who is full of doubt, who is full of curiosity, and he has many decisions left to make. And I think that kind of leads into and plays with that ... I mean, Nick he's curious and he's unsure and he's trying to find his way in the world. And I think in that way, I created someone who agrees with that person, who is really still trying to figure out who he is, and what he's made of and what he wants.
Yeah.
So in that way, I would say that, yeah, it's explored. I think where I leave him coincides with that.
Excellent. And there's a question, how did you go to such a dark place with Nick, and did it impact you personally while writing?
Yeah, it always impacts me personally. I think anybody who's familiar with any of my other work is aware of kind of the darkness of it, or willing to go into the shadows. And yeah, I mean, when I'm working on something like this, it takes a lot out of me, and I don't sleep very well. And my wife will tell you I probably go through little mini bouts of depression, and I have bad dreams. It's really quite the experience, to be honest. And it takes a little while once it's over to kind of rebound from that. Walker Percy the great Southern novelist used to call it the re-entry period. After he got done working on a novel, it takes him some time to almost let himself unwind from it all. I think if it didn't impact me personally, then it's not the novel I need to be writing.
Mm-hmm.
It's everything I've written, including Nick, pushes me emotionally and challenges me, and makes me uncomfortable in some ways. And I think if I'm not feeling those things, then it's doubtful that that's the novel I'm supposed to be writing.
Sure. Amy Williams is asking, was it always going to be Nick, or did you ever ponder writing Gatsby's history?
No, it was always Nick. Always Nick.
I can see a few people in the chat are saying they'd love to read Daisy's story.
Yeah, I'm sure she would. She's quite interesting, no doubt.
Yeah, there's more to her, perhaps, than Nick sees.
Oh yeah, I hope so.
Yeah. If Nick was to be made into a movie, who would you like to be cast as Nick, and why? That's a good question.
This is a good question, and it's really weird because in talking with some movie people about it, like, I'm so unfamiliar with really good 27, 28, 29-year-old Hollywood actors. It's just, I don't know. It's like hard for me to name any. But the one actor who I really admire, who falls into that category, who I've seen do some very like emotional, like straining roles and things, is Timothy Chalamet. I think would be a really interesting choice to play Nick.
Definitely, because it's sort of the Nick that we now see in Gatsby, this sort of he's whole and fine and kind of opaque as well as to who he is, but you've created this sort of this broken person inside all of this that you have made, which makes the Nick of Gatsby more interesting in a way, and that you can see how, I don't know, the kind of the smooth surface. There's so much behind it that we can now see of this person who has been through so much.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. And that was my experience when I went back and read Gatsby that last time, when I thought we were right at the edge of the final revision. The things he says and some of the things that he does just really struck me so differently then. Because I kind of could see what was behind his eyes, and what someone who comes to those decisions and comes to those manifestations, and who is really kind of almost in some way can separate from himself. It just it rang a bell with me in a way that I really hoped it would, because a little part of me was nervous to read it again. Been a while, and to see how it measured up, or if I needed to sit down and do a lot more work. And it did. It really struck me. Some of the things he said in those moments when he steps back, what else he's carrying with him that might cause him to do that.
Yeah, excellent. Well, I guess that's what the best of books of this ilk do, right? Like Wide Sargasso Sea, or that kind of thing. The echoes that they set up make you see the original differently.
Absolutely, and I love that book too. Jean Rees is one of my favorite writers, and her great gritty novels from the 30s, Paris novels, and Paris and London. But White Sargasso Sea, really, I probably read it several years before I read this final reading of Gatsby that made me write the book. And I thought it was so imaginative and so interesting. And I think it had to be in my subconscious somewhere. Like, I don't remember thinking about that book when the thing for Nick hit me. But as time has gone on and I've waited for this to come out, I've started thinking about Wide Sargasso Sea again as I reread Good Morning Midnight like a couple of years ago. And I thought, wait a minute, what else did she do? Oh yeah, Wide Sargasso Sea. And that, I think it had to be sitting in my mind somewhere. Because I thought it was very dynamic and very interesting very interesting literary project to do.
Definitely. I'm just having a look through the many questions that have been sent in, and Kathy is wondering why you sent Nick to New Orleans rather than let him go home. I guess you wanted to keep putting him through misery.
I didn't feel like Nick was ready to go home. I thought he was so changed. I just couldn't see any scenario where he would, leave France after what has happened in France, get on a boat, ride the boat to the New York harbor, get on a train, go to Chicago, get on another train, and be home in 2 hours. I just didn't feel like that was realistic, that he would do that. He was so different. He was it's such a state of transformation. and still really in such a state of kind of I mean, I think shell shock on some levels. He's having strange thoughts, and when he dozes off, it's filled with horrible visions.
And his hand, you have his hand shaking, don't you, all the time?
Yeah, he can't steady himself, and going at it. He's already begun to doubt home in his mind, and I didn't see a scenario where he was going straight home. He just had to do something else. I think going straight home would also, I think, been I felt it might have been a little cliche too. We've seen that movie where you go straight from whatever traumatic thing it is, perhaps war or battle, and you go straight home, and then all of a sudden you're just sitting there kind of, glassy-eyed looking out the window while mother and father and everybody else is coming in and going about their routine. We've seen that before, and I just thought I didn't like the reality of it, and I thought he could go and recover too. I think a large part of Nick is about recovery. People have asked me, is it a hopeful book? I said, well, I think Nick feels like it's about recovery to me, and him going to New Orleans, I think, was in some way, I need to go somewhere else, and I need to be by myself for a little while, and I just need to recover, and I just need to go to sleep and wake up and eat and go through a day and go to sleep and just not be bothered with all the extraneous stuff that is going to come with going home.
And not be around people that he knew either.
Right. He could go and be a stranger, and be left alone, which doesn't quite happen, but that's the thought behind it. I think that's kind of what I would want to do, and it seemed realistic to me that in that state that he would want to do it as well.
Mm-hmm. How do you feel about Nick now, having written about him and read Gatsby so many times? What do you think of him as a person or as a character?
I think he's as dynamic a character as I've ever written. I think he's probably a character too that will always be changing in my mind because of the project of it all. Different from my other books in which those characters I experienced their lives with them, but Nick's creation and the what I did with and what you're dealing with Gatsby. Like I think about Nick differently now than I did when I wrote it 5 years ago, and I think about it differently now than I did 2 years ago when I sat down to do the final revision. And then now that I'm talking about it and people are asking questions about it, like I sat down and reread the last 4 pages of Gatsby 2 weeks ago. And it was just completely different to like the interpretation of it all, both of Nick and of Gatsby, both was so different to me. I think it's always going to be in a state of evolution for me.
But I think that's what the best books.
I'm sorry. I feel like I feel a success in that too. That I've created a character that I'm never going to be quite sure about, because I don't like being able to just point your finger on something in those terms and define it so easily. I prefer things that, their definition kind of shifts and changes as time goes on.
It's still a bit slippery.
A little bit, yeah.
Yeah, but saying what you said earlier on about reading Gatsby at university and then finding different things in it as you get older. I think often we read some of these great classics when we're too young really to understand what to get out of them, and they're such different books when you come to them with a little more maturity or knowledge about the world or of who you are. They mean something so different.
Yeah, I think my experience with it all has been a testament really to what books or art in general can mean to us at different times in our lives. Like I said, if you would have told me before I did this that that's what I was going to do one day, I would have never ever believed you. And then, quite honestly, it was a reaction to I don't know that I've ever had that strong a reaction to a novel before, and I've had very strong reactions to novels as a reader and as a writer. But yeah, I think having children changes the way you read. Having getting married changes the way you read. Losing your job changes the way you read. Being stuck in a goddamn pandemic for a year changes the way you read. I mean, let's face it. We're different from one moment to the next. And I'm happy for that. I think if we read the same book the same way over and over and over and over, then that shows we're not changing and evolving and growing as people. And
Mm.
We need to be changing, growing, and evolving, I think.
Yeah. Interesting to read Gatsby, and by extension Nick, now 100 years later, where they had been through they're going into prohibition or coming out of prohibition, where they've had the Spanish flu in Europe, and here we are, kind of desperate for the gaiety of parties like Gatsby, maybe.
Yeah, I certainly understand the Roaring Twenties a lot better than I did. I feel like we're on the edge of a Roaring Twenties ourselves once we are able to, once we get out from the behind the curtain of all this. I expect we will be dancing and drinking and hugging each other and very happy in the sunshine, and there will be tremendous breaths of relief in places all over the world. I know, like even just like we had snow here last week, and we were in the house all week long, and in the last 2 days it's been 55 degrees and sunshine, and it just feels like it's you can almost see the light at the end of the tunnel, and with the vaccines and everything. So yeah, I certainly understand the Roaring Twenties now, why they acted the way they did, coming off of the war and the pandemic, and so the transition of prohibition, and just all those things. And I feel like I'm ready for the Roaring Twenties myself. I think.
How have you found writing over the last year, and what can we expect from you next?
I've actually I've been doing some screenplay stuff. My previous 3 novels, all of which are with No Exit Press, Desperation Road, The Fighter, and Blackwood, were all optioned for film, and I was attached to write the scripts for all of those, and I've done that. And so that's kind of what I've worked on the past year, and I've recently started working on a new novel, and it's been, I haven't sat down and written much prose since revising Nick. It's not been easy to kind of focus, I think, through all this, for me anyway, and other writers that I talked to have been the same way. Prose and writing a novel takes, like me, like very locked in, and a very strict consistency, and I haven't really had that because of the election and just all the bullshit that's been going on. So distracting. But the screenplay stuff I could kind of jab at easier. I could do in little bits here and there.
You'd already created the world and the story, I guess. So
yeah, I knew the story already. I knew how it ended. I didn't have to lay awake at night and wonder.
Yeah, I think that the constant buzz of anxiety that we all have right now must make it really hard for writers to access the kind of the creative subconscious, or however it works, because it always at the back of your mind you're worrying.
Yeah, I think that's very well said, and I thought I was a little isolated in feeling that until I started to talk to other writer friends, and I think you and I talked about this when we actually chatted earlier for The Guardian. Have you felt some of those things too? And I think it's normal, and I've just tried to release the anxiety of feeling that way, because I realize that you're not alone, and we all are not alone in how we've been feeling about things. And I think it's just okay to let it be. We keep trying, we keep working to do our best, but things are different. They're not going to be like this forever, but we keep trucking along for that moment when we are ready to feel normal again.
Yeah. So then Amy asked a question that I think would be a good one to end on. What can you recommend to us that you've read lately to help get us through the fag end of the pandemic? What are the great books that you've been reading?
What I've been doing lately is reading more nonfiction, because I've been really looking for as inspiration and as to keep myself motivated. I've been looking for stories about people who have done their own thing, and been brave about it, and been courageous, and like stuck their neck out, and created wonderful art, or created wonderful, I don't know, anything. And a couple of those books I've read Patti Smith's memoir, Just Kids, which is wonderful. And I read, there's a book by my friend Wright Thompson called Pappyland, about one of the bourbon empires here. But it also has a tremendous personal touch put into it that was really touching to me. And then I've also been reading, rereading as it may be, this book that I've been reading for 25 years, and it always gives me great comfort, and I would recommend it to anyone listening. It's called Letters to a Young Poet Rilke, the German poet Rilke. And it's an exchange of letters between Rilke and a young poet who used to write. They used to write back and forth to each other. He was looking for inspiration or feedback or whatever, the young poet was, from Rilke. And the exchange between those two is just really human and genuine. And Rilke talks so much about it's how it's okay to be alone. It's okay to be afraid. It's okay to feel doubt, but don't let those things become who you are. You just kind of let them be a part of your form, and just how you can use that as inspiration, and you can see how you see that as growth. And it's such a just kind of, every time I read it, I just feel better. I don't know any other way to put it. And I've been reading it for 25 years. I probably read it, twice a year, but I've been reading it again recently just because I know how it makes me feel, and I know how inspiring it can be, not just from a creative standpoint, but just from a human standpoint. So I would say that's a book I would steer everyone toward also. It's a lovely, short, wonderful, poetic read.
Wow, what a wonderful recommendation. It sounds like we should all be getting that. But I think I'm going to say thank you so much, Michael, for such a wonderful chat, and tell everyone that's listening that you can buy the book. It's out in hardback and ebook. There's a link at the bottom of the screen to buy a signed copy, but you can also buy it through bookshops online or from your local independent. I really recommend it. So yes, thank you for coming along, and I'm going to ask Ion, Michael's lovely publisher, to end the chat now. Thank you, everybody, so much for coming.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Alison.